Do you think it's imperative that countries compete globally in order to achieve economic development that would bring them into the group of middle or high income countries? And if that's the case, what do we say as global citizens to countries around the world that it doesn't seem have a readily apparent strategic comparative advantage that would catapult them into the middle or high income groups?
Well, that's a complicated question, and it's an interesting one to think about. The concept of comparative advantage, although seemingly simple, is actually quite a sophisticated, complex concept. Mm-hmm. And it's not well understood by many people, including, I think, many economists, actually. But the concept, which is still a good theory, we've had no evidence that there's anything wrong with the theory. Mm-hmm. It's a little hard to work out what it actually implies in some circumstances. But the theory really says that every country has some comparative advantage. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not that you don't have a comparative advantage. Every country has a comparative advantage by definition, according to the theory. And so every country can participate in trade with somebody else. In the two-country model of the world, mm-hmm. no matter who you are, you have some comparative advantage to trade with this other country, and both countries are better off afterwards if they do trade. Mm-hmm. So, and given the openness of the world today, every country has the potential to do this. The other important factor, however, is that no matter how fully you exploit whatever comparative advantage you have, trade itself is a very useful and very important and very valuable component of economic development, but it is by no means the most important element of economic development. And the reason for that is pretty simple. It's just that a relatively small fraction of any GDP, mm-hmm. there are one or two exceptions to this, or countries that are not really countries, but big cities like Hong Kong, but for mm-hmm. any comprehensive economy, there's no question that the part that is potentially tradable to exploit a comparative advantage is a relatively small fraction of GDP. And Japan is again another example of that. I mean, everybody would say Japan has been an enormously successful international trader, and that's absolutely true. Mm-hmm. However, the heavily traded sections of Japan's economy might explain or comprise 15% of its GDP. And the reason Japan is not progressed into the upper ranks of the rich countries is that the other 85% of Japan is actually relatively unproductive, and it's more like that of a middle-income country. So the combination is what explains Japan's position in the lower ranks of the rich countries, but it's absolutely essential for any country to have the more domestic-oriented parts of its GDP also be productive, or in the end it will not progress along the economic development trail. And how you get that done is turning out to be a lot more complicated than anybody ever anticipated. And despite all the successes we've had in opening up global trade and globalization, in this sense, globalization has not progressed all that far yet, because so many countries have such a large part of their GDP that's still relatively unproductive, and it's in almost every case concentrated in the domestic sectors.
So even with globalization and membership in the World Trade Organization of these countries, sometimes it's very hard to actually get the unproductive areas of those countries to change by any international political means, because it's in their sovereign right to keep it as it is.
Exactly. There is a connection, however, and that connection is, I mean, most of these domestic industries are service industries. And we have very different productivities in service industries around the world. That productivity cannot be transmitted to another market, to another country through trade, but it can be transmitted through foreign direct investment and the establishment of operations around the world locally producing services that are locally consumed. And the large successful service industries or service firms in the rich countries have shown they can go practically anywhere in the world, make investments and transmit their products. In this case, it's services industry at very high productivity, and 2/3 of the benefit of that action go locally because the labor employed is always, almost always local. It's almost 100% local, not always exactly 100%, but it's very high. So through the wages these people earn in high productivity operations, the value of that transaction, 2/3 of it at least accrue locally. So it's a very important thing to be done. But the barriers to that happening are enormous now, even in the rich countries. I mean, Europe is having a struggle with this. They have been unable to reach an agreement on services among the member countries of the EU. So a service firm can go from one country to the other, make the investment, hire local people and provide the service, and operate the way they do in their home country. If it's a higher productivity, they will be successful. And the Europeans, because of protection of incumbents, the protection and privileges that the special interests, in this case represented by the already existing local domestic firms, oppose this higher productivity, more efficient competition coming in. And if that happens in Europe, you can imagine what happens in India. And in India, that's exactly one of its biggest problems, in that still foreign retailers cannot go and open up an operation in India and have ownership and control of the operation. And that's a penalty, again, for the Indian consumers, and the protection, and it's a price they pay for the protection they are giving through their political process to the incumbents, to the local domestic producers of, in this case, retailing services.